Last evening, news broke that for more than a dozen years, Christianity Today, flagship magazine, failed to hold two ministry leaders accountable for sexual harassment at its Carroll Stream, Illinois office. This is an article that was reported by CT news editor Dan Silliman, who is a frequent guest on our show, edited by senior news editor Kate Shelnut, who we just talked to a couple days ago about something unrelated. So two people that we've come to know and appreciate over these last, we've known Kate a long time, Daniel maybe over the last year or so. But I wanted to bring this to air today in particular because it's an important story, but second of all, because one of the people who has been accused of this is Mark Galli, who's the former editor-in-chief of Christianity Today. And for those of you who have been longtime listeners to The Ride Home, you know that Mark Galli was a monthly guest on our show for years, 6 or 7 years maybe. And so we got to know Mark through the radio over that amount of time, and he shared a lot of really wonderful insights with us, and we really appreciated our friendship. And both, even though John's not here today, I know I can speak for him, both John and I incredibly grieved to read this story last night, just really sad about it and angry about it, and all those things that we have felt over the years when other ones of our guests have been found to have had issues related to sexual harassment or worse. And so, you know, I had a hard time going to sleep last night just thinking about all this and trying to come up with a way to talk to you all as listeners about it, a way to be honest from my perspective as a host about it. And I thought of Doug Bursch, who's been a wonderful friend to both John and I. And we've talked to Doug about a lot of things that have been difficult and personal. And I thought he would be a terrific person to kind of hash through this with. Doug is the co-pastor of Evergreen Foursquare Church in Auburn, Washington. He's the host and producer of the Fairly Spiritual Show radio program and podcast, also the author of a terrific book about living online, which is Posting Peace, Why Social Media Divides Us and What We Can Do About It. Doug, I'm so glad you're here. Welcome back.
Well, Kathy, thanks for having me on the show today. Of course, these are really difficult topics, but I'd love to be able to talk with you a little bit about how to process this, because we're all trying to process it.
Yeah. So the first thing I said, and I was speaking through my own lens as a radio host, that, we had a radio relationship with Mark for a long time. And of course, never knew that this was a thing that had been reported or, as according to the CT article tells us, had not been reported. So there were clearly a lot of internal problems at Christianity Today in their organization, Doug, about how they dealt with complaints and whether there was any follow through. So maybe we should talk about that first.
Yeah, well, it's interesting because the report talks about 6 or 8, I don't know if I have the exact number, 9 women who complained about a pattern of sexual harassment. And it's important, regardless if someone is like, well, how bad was the harassment, or those sorts of questions. The fact is, that's a problem when one or two individuals have repeatedly different women, in this case, reporting about troubling behavior. And it looks like from their own report is that those reports went nowhere. And they went nowhere in the sense that there was nothing actionable on them, so people stopped reporting. So that's always the question as well, is this just the tip of the iceberg? If you have an environment that doesn't seem to value reporting, and also the fear that if one reports, there might be retribution, or they might just stick out, that now there'll be a spotlight on them that they don't want, because this is not their fault. We must remember this in any form of reporting. Even the most minor, seemingly minor form of harassment, that person didn't choose to be harassed. It is not their fault, and they should have the right, and there should be an environment where they can clearly communicate anything that makes them uncomfortable. Every healthy work environment would welcome those kinds of expressions of reporting anything that makes you uncomfortable or seems wrong in the work environment.
Right. I think that in trying to come up with my thoughts on the matter and kind of thinking about how you and I might talk about this together, Doug, I come back to the fact that we are all complex people from different backgrounds, and different things seem scary or overwhelming or threatening or bothersome or whatever it is to us. And so part of learning to work together is that we kind of learn about each other, right? And we say, oh, you know what? I spoke too harshly to that person and made them cry. And I didn't mean to do that. And I feel badly about that. Or we could say an instance like that. And we'd say, I can't believe that person is so weak that they cried when I yelled at them. Do you know what I mean? Like there's two different ways to look at that. And I think that in an issue of sexual harassment, it can be the same type of thing where you have people who say, look, that was threatening to me. And the response from the quote unquote, alleged aggressor could be, I'm sorry I did that. Or it could also be, why are you so sensitive?
Yeah, well, there's a couple things to look at. One, I just want to remind your listeners, whenever anything that's been hidden in darkness comes to light, that's a good thing. And sometimes we get nervous, like we've heard a new revelation about a climate at Christianity Today and individuals involved in that climate. God is not surprised by this information. God has been aware of what's been going on. We're surprised, but it's always good for darkness to come into the light. Even if there's chaos following, even if there's a lot of not knowing how to respond or maybe even responding in the wrong way, it is always good. And this entire concept of Me Too movement is a huge thing. It's a good thing that no longer are we going to allow certain harassments, or any harassment, hopefully, to hide in the darkness. And that's a change in our culture. And I want to remind people, too, that just because it's been revealed, it doesn't mean that suddenly the world is falling apart. Actually, this kind of terrible stuff has happened throughout history. I'm not justifying it. It's just been hidden. In fact, in our church, I once had someone say to me, and this wasn't about harassment, but they said, it seems like our church has a lot more conflicts in the sense of, I hear about people having marital struggles or addiction problems. And the person said, it seems like we have more conflicts in the church I grew up in. And I said to them, I would respectfully say the difference between the church you grew up in and our church is we don't hide those things. We bring them into the light. And this is what we're seeing. And it's hard because our whole idea of Christianity, the conception of existence of
all the good people are going to gather on Sunday morning.
Yes, and it's all being shattered. We're seeing
and it
things
should
the
be
way
shattered.
God is.
It should be shattered because that was never what the church was supposed to be.
Yeah, and God has always seen it this way. So we're getting a better perspective of the reality, and now we can respond in redemptive ways or not. And this idea about how people respond to criticisms, here's an issue. How people respond and institutions respond is incredibly important. If people try to minimize accusations, explain away accusations, ridicule accusations, that is a problem. Yeah. Because if you love someone, even if you've done something that isn't wrong, if they perceive that you've done something wrong, you want to do everything in your power to make sure that never happens again. The issue is, I'm sorry, I didn't realize that. Now that I do, I'm sorry, I will never do that again. You are allowed to speak to me about these issues. And also in a work environment, I'm going to go to the proper authorities because the very fact that I'm a person in positions of leadership means there's an unfair power differential. So you don't have to talk to me. You can talk to my supervisors. I will listen to what they say. That's the goal of a repentant person. But when we minimize and justify and explain away, that's a sign that we are not advocating for a healthy work environment. And that's true in a healthy marriage, a healthy family, a healthy church. And so I don't think it matters whether they're little accusations or big accusations. The responses really tell you about the health or the lack of health in that culture.
Yeah, no, that's a very good point. Doug Bursch is my guest. He's the author of Posting Peace, Why Social Media Divides Us and What We Can Do About It. Doug, why does this keep happening? Is a very basic question. And well, first of all, I'll let you answer that.
Yeah. I mean, if I could answer it, I am the most arrogant man in the world. Even talking as a man, I don't realize I have much authority to speak about anything. I know as a pastor, I've seen people do terrible things, destroy their marriages, destroy their families, do things that are so irrational, even for whatever supposed benefit they were to get out of it. The amount of harm that it caused, it is complete madness. And I think as Christians, we'd say at some level that shows the depravity of humans. I also think it's important, though, is that we have in our culture this idea of there are monsters and then there are good people. And the monsters are the people who do terrible things. Now, there are monstrous actions, and I understand why we call people monsters, but there's a problem with this. when we say only monsters harass people, only monsters abuse, only monsters, sexually abuse, then we don't look at those problems in the regular people. Because the reality is it's not just monsters. There's people who 80, 90, 95% of their life can produce good fruit. They can do good things, but they take one area of their life and they refuse to bring it into the light. And they can do monstrous things because of that. Abuse, harm, neglect, total depravity in that area, whether it's 5% of their life or 80% of their life. And this is really important. If we don't see how these things are in us, that unchecked, we can be just as depraved as others. Unchecked or unaccountable, we can do just as much harm to other people. Then we're not going to catch things earlier where we can deal with things at the beginning. Because a culture, for instance, should be the moment someone feels uncomfortable, right, we talk about that because we don't want it to go any further. But if it's hidden, if it's allowed to grow, then you get these extreme expressions. So I think at some level, that's the issue. The more you suppress things, the more it hides in the darkness, and the greater it becomes in its consequences, its evil consequences.
Doug, I wish I could say that this is the first time this has happened, that we've had a guest who's ended up, kind of living a double life. It's sadly not. I have a whole list of people who we have developed relationships with over the years who've ended up being in some sort of sexually abusive position. A lot of them have come to public scandal and come to public ruin. And I think all of us, male or female, it doesn't matter. Anyone who believes in Jesus and loves the church sees a story like this and is grieved over and over again that we're living through this and we see this come to light. And it's difficult. It's a difficult thing to process. So if you're hearing this and you were a fan of Mark when he was on the show, or you very much love Christianity Today, which, by the way, has released a very, I think, well-worded statement from their new editor, Timothy Dalrymple, about this. You can read that on CT's website. Or if this is reminding you of something in your own life, let me just say, I'm going to be very forthright about this, that I was bothered enough that I went and spoke to my therapist about this morning, because it's hard to come to terms with. And it's hard to accept that people who present as one thing are something different. At the same time, Doug, I also want to say that our responsibility as Christians is just what you said, to recognize that the monster is us. And I'm not looking out there and pointing at whoever it is and saying the evil's over there, because the evil's in here inside me as well. And so while it's important to say that that's not acceptable, that can't happen in the workplace and we're going to stop it, at the same time, I want to be a person who recognizes that we all have a common sin problem and we need to be honest about who we are. So I don't know where I'm going with all of that, except to just say that that's how I feel about it.
Well, one, I'm sorry, even Kathy, that you've been sinned against in that way. When anyone betrays trust, that's a trust that's been betrayed for you as you've worked with these people. And it should break our hearts when we're sinned against. That's not a bad thing that our hearts are broken. It's a sign that we have the heart of Christ. And, I don't think that everything is equal, in the sense of there are sins that greatly harm people. I understand that we can all be sinful, but people who've been abused and harmed and hurt, the consequences of that, the marring of the image of Christ within us, the shame, the guilt, those are lifelong struggles for people. So we must take it seriously when we see any form of abuse. As a pastor, I've had to turn in people to the police when I found out about abuse, and immediately did that. Friends that had lied to me found out abuse, and they're in prison now. And then I think about that. What was that about, Lord? How could that person be so duplicitous? How could I not know? How could I have not seen, right? And so we begin to not trust. We begin to be afraid of any person. I understand why people are afraid of leaders, afraid of men, because they have enough background to prove that they shouldn't trust people. For me, that's where I have to entrust my heart to God and trust that God is going to be enough for me when people betray me. And those lonely places is also where we find the true voice of God. I don't know why people do these things. But I also want to not pretend that I'm above this. So I want to put every area of accountability possible. And if anyone sees anything in me or says anything to me that makes me uncomfortable, instead of trying to explain it away, I want to do everything in my power to thank you for pointing it out. And then not making it their job to make me be a better person, but actively in my own self, find ways to serve God, to serve those in authority, to serve those that I've harmed or even perceived to have harmed. That to me is being the servant of all. And if people are afraid to do that, then their pride is in the way. And that's where all of us as listeners can do that. If it's one thing to justify ourselves, but our goal is to facilitate healthy relationships. And so that means I'm going to take seriously, like even my wife, if my wife is remotely concerned or scared of me, I don't explain that away and tell her to view it differently. Yeah. I submit, surrender, and repent. If my kids don't want to come to the house because they're afraid of me, I don't justify that and say, well, it's their fault. I submit, I surrender, and I repent.
Right. Okay. But a common theme in a lot of the stories that I know intimately, not intimately because I have not been the aggrieved party. I want to be honest about that. I want to be forthright. I was not the aggrieved party. But the stories that I'm familiar with, that was not the case, Doug. And that's the flag that we're talking about, is that when confronted, instead of saying, oh my gosh, I am so sorry you took it that way, how can I make it right? It has been the opposite of that. It's been like, I can't believe, just the way we started the conversation, that she's so sensitive. I can't believe that he, can't take it. And that to me is where we all need to sit up and take notice. If someone says that to us and we respond that way, we're already down the wrong path.
Yeah, well, and we have a culture that lifts up narcissists, and this is the struggle I have. We vote for narcissists, we put them in positions of power, we justify their sins, we celebrate the fact that they don't apologize or repent. Right. So yes, we blame abusers, but we also need to look at a culture that glorifies people who don't apologize, don't repent, and are some of the most narcissistic, proud, arrogant people on the planet.
Right, and that's all over the church. Those are going to be our leaders. Right.
Yeah, it's in the church leadership. It's in political leadership.
Right. It's all over the place. Yeah. Did you listen to the Mars Hill podcast?
I listened to some of it because we went through that in the Seattle area, and I actually talked about the concerns I had for Mark Driscoll were the same. The people he worked with were being harmed. I mean, there's all kinds of other tangential things, but he had pastor after pastor who had a traumatic experience with him. And anytime he was confronted, he just refused to admit that he had a problem. And that's trouble. You just can't have leaders who believe they're somehow more perfect than the rest of us. So same kind of issue in the church. And people want power, are wanting power, wanting to be on the radio, even for me, there's an ego in that.
Sure.
And so those people wanting to edit a magazine, that ego unchecked can lead to this kind of terrible stuff.
Yeah, you're right. And there also is something sick about us, either as congregants, as parishioners, as people that download podcasts or people that buy books or whatever it is, that we tend to like people who are like that. There's something about us that's attracted. I know we're attracted to strong leaders. I get that. But there's something that we like about the fact that, oh, well, that guy's not going to take any flack, or that guy's not going to bow down to whatever. And he's going to. And then we end up looking down the line, and there's just it's just littered with people who've been injured, littered.
Yeah. Well, and I think among Christians, we also need to look at our view of women in general. And if we have a low view of women in ministry, and if we believe women cannot lead us, teach us, help us, then we're going to view them primarily in terms of how they serve us, in terms of sex, pregnancy, procreation. And so when you start training men at an early age to view women just on how they can serve you, you have a problem. When you start seeing women as Christ in your presence, listening for the voice of Christ in them, you treat them differently. And that's something I don't think we're still willing to have a conversation about. But a low view of women spiritually will lead to a low view of women in every area of their life.
Yeah. Doug, I'm grateful you were able to come on and talk about this difficult subject.
Yeah, I'm sorry. For your listeners, I want to remind them that God knows.
Yep.
God knows, and He's with us.
All right, Doug. Doug Bursch, check out his book, Posting Peace, Why Social Media Divides Us and What We Can Do About It. Thanks, Doug. See you soon.
Thanks.